Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. Thank you for joining me. It is Tuesday, the 10th of July, and this is we had a gap last week, so our previous show was repeated a number of times. I hope you all had a wonderful July 4th weekend or midweek or whatever that was. It was a wonderful week weather-wise. But it was a little strange having July 4th on Wednesday, and then, most people or many people had to work Monday, Tuesday, had Wednesday off, and then work back on Thursday and Friday again. So it didn't really feel like July 4th a lot of the time. So anyway, it put me in mind of things, as we go on with our conversations in Manchester and how our education system is in need of greater support than it gets, and there are very differing opinions on that. Well, actually, to be truthful, I think that the lines are pretty plainly drawn. There are those who support an adequate public education, that we should have the best schools we can have in order to create an educated and well balanced and developed next generation of students. And there are those who oppose the idea, and you can pick your spot across the spectrum, but that's sort of where it is. But I do think that in the period before July 4th, the show that we did right there, we had a visitor on, and so we were a little short on time. But I do want to, as we begin another year, sort of post July 4th, I think days like July 4th serve to help us to recognize the things that unite us and the things that make us, that bring us together, and the things that divide us are much smaller than we sometimes make them out to be. And especially in this period of very divisive national politics, and when our rhetoric has stooped into the gutter quite a bit. I think it's important that we all recognise that most people are decent, good human beings living their lives and trying to do their best. And then there's a small group of people in the chattering class, and I guess I might be included as those in the chattering class. But there are those who are louder than the opinions. Their loudness makes them appear to represent a larger segment of the population than they actually do, and then there are those who think that rudeness and even abusiveness is sort of the coin of the realm. I was looking at the Union Leader and Mark Hayward's article in the City Wide, which is an insert that is delivered to every mailbox in Manchester. And given that over the last few weeks, the issue of immigration, and in particular the issue of children being separated from families on our southern border, was the topic du jour, or a major headline for a number of weeks, and it disturbs me that and I don't mean to attack the press. Sort of, it's easy to do, because I think the press really just represents the interests of the people, right? That is reflecting what the people either want to hear or what the people are interested in, etc. And you don't sell newspapers, or you don't have people watching television or radio shows or listening to radio shows if the things that are being covered are not of interest to the people watching them. And it is, the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" kind of thing mentality is certainly at play here. And what disturbs me is that the terrible things that were happening on our southern border and that were highlighted for a period of a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and we were agog at them, and they were front of mind, have disappeared off the national conversation. The families are still separated. Nobody knows where the infants are. There is no significant national conversation going on about it anymore, and the administration goes on unabated in its attacks on immigrants. And we've seen just in the last couple of weeks a number of things. We've had Jeff Sessions announce that people who are threatened by gang violence and street violence on the streets of their home countries, that will no longer be considered as an adequate or proper claim for asylum. So if you arrive at the United States border at a border post and you appeal for asylum because you're in fear of your life, if the basis for that fear is that there are armed gangs or violent gangs who have threatened you or your children. And in these cases, there was a lady on the other night who said that she had 2 children, and one of her sons, who was 15, had been murdered by the gang in her hometown in whichever country in Central America she came from, that she had been threatened, and that her 11-year-old son had also been threatened that he would be killed if he didn't partake in other words, start killing himself. And so she fled her community. And I guess when that person, starting as of this past week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has said that fear of one's life will no longer be an adequate reason for being accepted with asylum status. Now, I don't know where one wants to parse all these things out and where the lines fall, but clearly we know we're shifting to a punitive position on our southern border. We have the Department of Justice now investigating. And as a new thing, investigating members of the armed services to see people, current members of the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force are being investigated. They're going through the ranks to see who can they find who are not legal residents of the United States or may have entered the country illegally, etc. So that's a long, long way from a policy of looking at somebody who has gone off to Iraq or Afghanistan and has served the United States bravely and proudly, and finding a way to be grateful to them for their service, and instead of that, we're going in the opposite direction. It's all very sad. We've had the Supreme Court uphold the so-called Muslim ban, and the Muslim ban was a Muslim ban, and then the Trump administration eventually added a couple of countries, Venezuela and another, so that it wouldn't be exclusively predominantly Muslim countries. And so eventually, at the third try, it was found to be constitutionally sound. And it may well be constitutionally sound. People brighter than me, with greater knowledge of constitutional law than me, will know the answer to that. But whether it's constitutional or not, one has to ask 2 things. One, is it moral or not, or just or not? And also, is it not doing as I feel it is, which is inflicting harm on America and on its image across the world, and actually making us less safe? When one can hold up, if there were a Christian ban on travel to a Muslim country, then we would be up in arms at that. But however, the whole issue of immigration is an issue that's going to be with us for a long time. The reason why it affects me is because I guess being having come to the United States 25 years ago, the whole issue of immigration, and for any Irish person, because of the history of having to overcome the problems of immigration and the struggles that immigrants have, that the Irish community and the Irish nation has had for centuries, then every Irish person should be sensitive to this. But I believe everybody, since we're all immigrants in the first place, should be sensitive to it. I'm also conscious of the fact that we have a significant number of people here in the Manchester School District who are immigrants. Now, let's be very clear that many of these immigrants are here legally, and there has to be a difference drawn between multiple groups within what we might describe as the immigrant community, because the immigrant community writ large is made up of even people like me. It is also made up of people who have come here illegally. They're illegal only insofar as they have not gone through the very meagre and difficult legal process that exists. And if I had one single bugbear with the conversation that people have on the immigrant issue and on the immigration issue is there's a sharp line in many people's minds, and usually in conservatives' minds, around this thing of they're here illegally, they enter our country illegally, and therefore they're illegals, and since you're illegal, you've disrespected our laws in our country, you should go back where you came from. Of course, the reality is that we have made immigration to this country extremely difficult. And everybody knows the dirty little secret in the room is that Congress has not altered or renewed or changed our immigration policy in 30 or 40 years. And the dilemma that my Republican friends or the people in the Republican Party, the dilemma that they find themselves in is that the country needs immigrants because we need a growing population, and the thing that's going to distinguish us from a Germany or a Scandinavian country or many other countries, even including Russia, is that many of those countries have got declining population trends. We have had a continually growing population, and that has been healthy for us economically. And so our industry requires immigrants, our agriculture requires immigrants, our service industry requires immigrants, our tourist industry requires immigrants. And frankly, the country couldn't work as it does today without them. And all of us would be spending more money for services and tourism facilities and everything, and food, etc., if we didn't have it. Secondly, or thirdly or fourthly, wherever we are, the 11 or so million people who were in the United States so-called illegally today, if they and their families were ever to, if we could wave a magic wand and they were removed from the economy tomorrow night, then billions and billions of dollars would be lost, and there would be towns and cities across the United States and neighborhoods in those cities where stores and would be closed, where factories couldn't remain open, where housing prices would collapse, where neighborhoods would be abandoned, and so it's entirely impractical. And the problem for our Republican friends is that they know this, but yet if they introduce a sensible immigration policy that might say, let's find a way of solving this, let's have a path to citizenship, and that's like the third rail. You can't touch that. If you touch that, then we're going to run primary opponents against you and run you out of office. And let's be very blunt about it too, that there is a real racism and a bigotry associated, not by everybody at all. And it's easy to say that, if I disagree with people on immigration policy, they call me a racist, and I'm not. I'm not calling anybody any names. People are entitled to have their opinions on this topic, but don't anybody forget, or don't anybody pretend, when you're out there taking your staunch opinions against immigrants, etc., have a look at the people standing to your left and the people standing to your right. And when some of the people standing to your left and right are white supremacists, are racists, and are people of intolerance, then don't pretend that that somehow that doesn't represent some, that you are actually on that side of the fence. That need not necessarily taint you. I think it's entirely possible that somebody wants to be very strict on immigrant policy in the United States and be entirely a sound thinking person with regard to race and ethnicity, etc. But to pretend that it isn't so is a nonsense. It was wonderful 2 weeks ago, or the week or so before Thanksgiving. I've forgotten the date, but there was a rally at City Hall to highlight this issue of separation of children from their parents. An absolutely abhorrent and appallable thing to be doing by any government. And it was great to see about 300 or 400 people at rally in City Hall. And I saw one reporter write that it was the second largest rally that they'd seen at City Hall in recent years, and I was very privileged to be there and be in support of it. I also want to commend my friend, going back to the citywide piece, Mark Hayward of the Union Leader, not known for its left-wing bias or anything, but he has a piece in the citywide articles dated Friday, July 13th. That's kind of hard to be Friday, July 13th, because I already have it in my hand. But it's entitled Far from the Mexican Border, New Hampshire Family Feels Pain of Immigration Policy. It says, our nation collectively recoiled, this is from Mark Hayward, our nation collectively recoiled 2 weeks ago over the realization that immigration officials are ripping apart families who appear at the Mexican border crossing, sometimes putting thousands of miles between parent and innocent child. If you think that only happens in places like Arizona and Texas, talk to Andres and Leslie Mata. American citizens, Andres and Leslie are preteens who live in Manchester. In other words, members of... they're 11 and 9 years old, and they live here in Manchester. In other words, they go to Manchester public schools, and they're sitting in classrooms with all the other kids, and there are others like them there. This spring, their government arrested their father, who was in the country illegally, according to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In early May, ICE deported Gonzalo Mato Perea to Mexico. That meant no father to help Andres and Leslie celebrate Mother's Day or their First Communion. Dad was absent for Father's Day. No dad to cheer on their last day of school at Jewett Street School. Perea won't be around to keep an eye on Andres and Leslie when they bicycle in the neighbourhood east of Wilson Street. He can't organise memorable family outings such as the spontaneous family trip to Funtown Splashtown, USA in Maine 2 years ago. Once school starts, no dad will cheer Andres on at basketball games, and no dad to spoil his kids with a treat or soften the consequences when mum lays down the law. They're separating families. Why should they do that? Said Andres, who was 11. They have no heart. If there is any consolation for Andres, it's that he is not alone. The federal government deported 1,140 people from New England between October and March, according to data supplied by ICE. They leave behind people such as Norma Surya, who abruptly became a single parent when Perea was deported, and Stephanie Surya, 18, her older daughter. Stephanie put her plans for a Southern New Hampshire University marketing degree on hold and is trying to fill in the financial hole left by her stepfather's departure. Norma's main constant fear is she won't be able to provide like he did, said Stephanie, who translated for her mother. Perea worked construction and brought in $400 a week. His wages paid the $980 a month rent for the family's 3-bedroom apartment, utility bills, and just about everything else. Norma makes $10 an hour washing dishes part-time for a special events company. Stephanie, who just graduated from Memorial High School, works full-time in that company's office. So there's a snapshot of an immigrant family, and that immigrant family, ladies and gentlemen, looks no different and is no different than the thousands of French Canadian workers who came down over the Canadian border in the late 19th century seeking work in mills in Manchester. It's no different than the thousands of Irish immigrants who arrived in Manchester after the Great Famine from 1847 onwards, and the population of Irish people in Manchester went from a few hundred in 1847-48 in that period to something like 13,000 by the end of the 1850s. And continued to grow from there. And those families struggled in exactly the same way. And I just don't understand how good, decent living, honourable, perhaps Christian or whatever other religious denomination they may be, people living in the city of Manchester can look upon their immigrant neighbours and treat them with disdain and with lack of sympathy. This idea that immigrants are illegal and therefore it's just a name, because the truth of the matter is, if it was possible for somebody to go to the United States Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, or in Guatemala City, Guatemala, or in San Salvador, El Salvador, and walk into the U.S. Embassy and say, "I'd like to apply for a work visa to work in the United States, please." And I'd like to bring my my family with me. If that were possible and people could do that without, then many would do it. The point is, it's not possible. However, if you are a friend of Jared Kushner's family and you have $500,000 to spend, all you have to do is buy one of his apartments in New York, and then he and his family will help you to get permanent residency. No matter however reprehensible or good or bad a person you might be, and however whatever your history might be, you will be welcomed into the United States because you have met that criteria. That's the fundamental part of the problem, is that there is not an option for people. We have a need. The demand is there clearly, and so we need to solve the problem. And our Congress needs to step up and do this. In the end, President Trump is only ever going to play with it because he has found himself a wedge issue where a substantial minority, if not more, of the people in the United States, certainly in the Rust Belt, are fearful of losing jobs to immigrants and all the things that go with it. And they're not like us, and they're little brown people, and they're little yellow people, and they're little other colour people. Be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. And he's got himself a winning issue. I think we have. We'll take a break for a moment at this time, and we'll have somebody join us when we come back. Thank you. Welcome back, folks, to Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. Before I introduce my guest, I do want to. I got wrapped up on the immigration issue and the kids in our school system over the first half there, but I think it's very important, as I mentioned in each of these shows during the summertime, that parents take the opportunity to not have this complete drop off in education from the end of the school year to picking up again in September. So if you go on the Manchester School website, Manchester School Board or School District website, mansd.org, there is a ton of resources there. There are a ton of resources there. There's a required reading for every kid in the school district from grades 9 through 12, and you'll see that there's a citywide, every one of the high schools has got the same book that it will be used as a minimum. And then if you go in, you'll be able to look at the individual schools, because in high school there will be further requirements for different English courses, and you can find that online. But what's I think even innovative, because at least I haven't seen it before, is that also this year on the Manchester School Board, on the Manchester School website, mansd.org, there is a list of recommended reading for every grade from kindergarten right through, and it's a list of books in fiction, non-fiction, some poetry for each grade, all the way up through the elementary schools, through the middle schools, and out through the high schools. So if as a mom or dad and you want to encourage little Johnny or little Mary, whoever it may be, our superintendent, Dr. Bolgan Vargas, from the moment he came here a year and a few months ago, has been a great advocate of reading as being one of the key things that will help kids to move forward. So, with that little public announcement of hoping you all are having a great summer and continue with those efforts, I'd like to welcome a guest on our show here tonight, a candidate for office in the first congressional district. I'd like to welcome Lincoln Soldati. Welcome, Lincoln.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you. So I know that the race for the first congressional district is quite crowded, etc. So,
well, it is now. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I'm one of those guys who you'll have to forgive my ignorance I'm not quite within the political fold, and so I'm deeply embedded in education issues, and I don't pay enough attention. So excuse my ignorance of who all the candidates are. But I'd love you to take a moment to maybe tell me where you're from and what was your entree to this to running.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm a New Hampshire native. I grew up in Portsmouth and Exeter. Was born in New Hampshire, so went to schools in New Hampshire for the most part. I went to St. Thomas Aquinas High School. I went on, did my undergraduate at University of Notre Dame. I was drafted in 1969. After a couple of years in the Army, I went back to Notre Dame on the GI Bill. Then I came back to New Hampshire to go to law school. After law school, I practiced a little bit, and then I was elected Stratford County Attorney when I was living in Somersworth with my wife. And I was Stratford County Attorney for 9 terms, 18 years. I also served, because this is an education show, I served 8 years on the Somersworth School Board, so I'm very familiar with education issues on a very local level and kind of the difficulties that most communities,
right.
And we were a poor community as Somersworth, so we know, I know firsthand all those kinds of struggles. I was also the mayor of Somersworth, so I've been in the service of my community for a long time. And I was, when I finished as county attorney, I was a defense attorney criminal defense attorney for just about the remainder of my career. And after nearly 40 years, I finally retired from the practice of law and became an Uber driver.
Really? Good. I've done myself, so you have that
well, there you go. Yeah. So I also spent some time in the West Bank in Palestine. Mentoring Palestinian public defenders. I also drove out to North Dakota to the Standing Rock Reservation to try to help the Sioux Nation with their water rights. So I've done a number of things on an activist level. Going back to 1968, actually.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Those were great years.
In many ways, they were, yes.
Yeah. Well, tumultuous years.
Yeah, yes.
Tumultuous years.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your service and all of it, right? Not your service to the U.S. military, but it's what a wonderful resume, to have done so much for so long. I have to tell you, you've already enamored yourself to me, and we don't really know each other at all, right? But you're wearing the badge, New Hampshire Immigrant Solidarity.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And every the first Tuesday of every month, I'm here in Manchester.
Oh, are you? At the
8:30 in the morning. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I've been there a number of days, only 2 or 3, but I've been there, and I had the privilege of speaking actually at an interfaith gathering on immigration at St. Anne St. Augustine Church about a month ago, and it was a wonderful occasion. And so anyway, so it's an issue, so close to my heart. Too.
Well, I loved your comments. I was listening in the green room beforehand as you were talking about immigration issues, and that's an issue that also is very, very close to my heart. Not only because I'm the grandson of immigrants. My grandfather and grandmother came over from Italy, a little after the turn of the century, and. He was a stonemason. You were talking about how people came here to make a better life for themselves. Right. He was a stonemason, very hardest working man I ever met in my life.
Right.
My grandmother was beloved by her community. They settled in Somersworth eventually, raised 7 kids. My grandmother never learned English, and she was beloved in her community. And my grandfather and grandmother, under today's policies, would not be allowed in this country, and I find that, frankly, outrageous.
It is. Yeah. It is outrageous.
And there's one other reason, too, and that is that I consider myself the grandfather of a refugee, a young man who escaped from West Africa. His parents had been assassinated, got to our southern borders, took quite a while for him to do it, and he was a teenager at the time. He was 16, just about to turn 17, when he turned himself in to the southern border, and ICE, you know what ICE is, they actually forged his birth certificate so it would appear that he was 18. And the reason they did that is that at 18, they could put him in a detention facility, whereas if he was underage, they couldn't. And so they forged his date of birth, and they held him for about 18 months. He was held in Boston and in actually Stratford County. And eventually he was granted refugee status. The city of Somersworth, the school department, welcomed him as a student. He actually taught himself English while he was incarcerated in detention with nothing more than a French dictionary, French-English dictionary, and whatever books he could get, and he would literally translate them word by word to teach himself English. And then he needed a place to live for the school to have him matriculate. And so I'm proud to say that my son opened up his home to him. And so he calls my son Papa, and he refers to me as Grandpa, my wife Grandma, and he spends 2 nights a week on the weekend because he works in Portsmouth where my wife and I live. He spends 2 nights a week with us at our home, and we consider it a privilege to have him.
What a wonderful, wonderful story. You know, the disconnect in modern America from people who have, we have our experience with Japanese internment during World War II.
Yes, exactly.
And they,
horrible experience.
And this is important that I think that people, this is not America bashing in any sense.
Right.
It's simply highlighting that we are human too, right? We're a nation that made mistakes.
Right.
What makes us great is we recognize those mistakes.
That's right.
And we moved on to better.
And hopefully we don't repeat them.
Correct, correct. And so when people read literature, like I don't know how people can read sort of even something you might like The Grapes of Wrath, and you think about in this case within the this location within the United States.
That's right.
And if you read that wonderful work among thousands of other such pieces, and how you can't identify with in this case refugees in California, being treated badly, mistreated, and used by. They may not be called coyotes or mules or whatever they're called some other name, but it's the same thing.
Right.
And or the Diary of Anne Frank, or all the things that people grew up with and know, and all of a sudden, because of looking at it through a political prism, they can't recognize that separating children and babies from their parents on the southern border is not.
Well, it's un-American.
It's un-American.
I mean, it absolutely is un-American, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you look at the Statue of Liberty. And you look at the plaque on there, give me you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That's really what built this country.
Right.
That absolutely is what this country is all about.
Right.
From the very beginning.
Right.
From the very beginning of this country.
A French immigrant from Manchester, René Gagnon, raised a flag on Iwo Jima during World War II, and a first generation American from Manchester. I don't understand it, but of course. I don't want to get into sort of that issue too much, but just it is a wedge issue, and those who want to divide us. And I talked at the very start of this program tonight about July 4th was an opportunity for all of us in America to celebrate that which unites us and makes us great.
Right.
And that there are those who are a small group but are loud and vociferous and therefore appear to be larger than they are, who would seek to divide us.
Right.
Let's talk about, since we're here, education, because that's what the folks on here and what we spend our time doing is education. Where do you stand on public education funding and the state of it in New Hampshire today and what we might do?
Well, having served on a school board for so many years, I am a huge proponent of public education, and throughout my life, I've lived in New Hampshire my whole life, and virtually through all of my life, New Hampshire has never funded education at the level it should have. And indeed, that's what Claremont was all about, the Claremont case, obviously, because the court actually found that our Constitution, our state Constitution, mandates that I think the language is that we cherish education. And the court said that means that you have to fund an adequate education. Right. And unfortunately, too often, our legislature in New Hampshire has tried to avoid that responsibility and find ways not to do that. So I think we have a long way to go. I mean, I think we should have pre-K, a public pre-K, fully funded. All the way through 12th. I think that we should have certainly lower tuition costs. We have the highest tuition costs of a state university in the country.
In the country.
In the country. And there's no excuse for that.
And 60% of the students graduating Manchester high schools who do go on to college choose to go to colleges outside of New Hampshire.
Well, yes, because many of them are cheaper.
Yes, and
certainly.
The problem is that even if one was to support the massive cut that was made to the New Hampshire university system by the Bill O'Brien administration back about 5 or 6 years ago. It was done, or 7 years ago, it was done because we were in a time of, they would have said, economic free fall, et cetera, entirely brought on by their policies, of course. Right. But even if you were to accept that premise, which I don't, even if you were, then in a time of the highest employment rate in recent history, why would one not reinstate the funding?
Well, and of course, it's been completely counterproductive because the exact opposite of what was intended happened. And what is happening now is you have young people in this state who are leaving the state in droves. They leave whether because they go to another university somewhere else or a college somewhere else, as you said, or because we have not done the job of preparing them. There are, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country in this state, and we have employers who cannot find workers that can do their jobs. And, if we were smart about the way we fund education, about encouraging the right type of education to make our education correspond with the type of jobs that are in this state, and a lot of jobs, and we're talking good paying jobs, then we'd see a lot fewer young people fleeing this state. We need to do something to bring these young people back because that's our future. People, my age, I'm not going to be around and the baby boomer age, so to speak. We're not the ones that are going to be filling jobs that these employers are looking for. We're all sort of getting out of the workforce gradually.
We need to be replaced.
We need to be replaced.
Some of us
we
would
need
be
it
easier,
by younger people.
And some of us would be easier to replace than others.
Absolutely true. Yes.
As a guy who has, I will have 3 kids in God willing, I'll have 3 kids in university next year: a senior, a sophomore, and a freshman. And
good luck.
I think we're going to have to go on cable or wherever. Where do they pay? I don't know. They don't pay here. But the point, when I think about having those 3 kids very close together, I have another one yet to go through the system. But when I look at, their peer group are kids that I know very well, and those groups of families, and so that's right, as in the modern vernacular, or parlance, that's right in my wheelhouse right now, and so I look at the faces on the graduating classes in the Manchester high schools, and I see them going off, and Manchester has done a very good job. But it's very, as the least well-funded school district in the state of New Hampshire on a per capita basis. It's got the highest number of pupils per student in the state of New Hampshire. A shameful circumstance. And despite that, we still send kids off to Harvard and to Hanover and to all these places. But I see them, not to be overly dramatic or melodramatic about it, but I think about the hordes of people, thanks be to God, now over, who for generations left in ships from Ireland and people sort of waving goodbye at the dockside. We have nothing so dramatic in New Hampshire, but we are sending people off in U-Haul vans to go to college, and we know that many of them are not coming back.
That's right.
That brings me to sort of creating the conditions, and here in Manchester, there is hope. It's always the glass half full stuff because there are so many people and young people working hard to change this thing, and we have some new people in our politics, at the local level who are pushing for, is it Work, Stay, Play or something, New Hampshire, and and other groups like that who are working, but. The business community in the Greater Manchester area is strongly in favour of having high-speed rail rail or commuter rail
Yes.
to connect to Boston, and that's a bi-directional thing. It isn't just for our people to go south into Massachusetts,
Right.
but rather the opposite just as much. Where do you stand on the rail project?
Well, certainly, I think that that having commuter rail would be a big boon in both directions, frankly. And I think not only would it help us retain a lot of the students and young people that grew up here, it would help us to retain them and have them continue to live here, and they could commute to whatever the types of opportunities they might have in Boston and the surrounding areas to that. But I think also it would offer us the opportunity to bring in students from many of the universities and systems that surround. There's a tremendous resource available in terms of intellectual resource, in terms of talent that's available in Boston and the surrounding areas, because it is such a tremendous economic hub. Obviously, some of the best schools in the country around that area. So it would allow us also to bring, as you say, in the other direction. So a lot of these jobs where we have employers that are wanting to find people to fill their jobs, it would be an opportunity for people who actually, young people from that area, to come up here to work in this area. So I think you'd actually benefit on both ends of it. But we need that talent. We absolutely need that talent. We have to do things that encourage young people to stay.
And so, just to be clear, you do support efforts
The idea
to
of commuter
bring
rail,
commuter
absolutely.
rail
Absolutely.
So because the thing that I agree with what you just said too. Hopefully not turning this into a total love fest, but
Let's find something to disagree.
Yeah, so
on,
there you
we?
go. We'd have to go to soccer.
Well,
Man United or Liverpool
yeah,
or
I
something
think
that
that
might
might do
divide
it,
us.
yeah.
So no, but because it seems to me that if you were sort of landing here as an alien, from wherever, and you looked at alien in the sense of outer space, and you landed here and you looked at the opportunity for New Hampshire. For a long time we had the New Hampshire Waste or New Hampshire Advantage thing, and we made great play of we are not Massachusetts, which I think is fine. I think that's good.
Yeah.
But I think we should be much more cynical in our sort of approach and embrace Massachusetts, because if you're a man or a woman, a parent who sticks up their periscope, metaphorically speaking, around the United States to look at education opportunities for your young man or woman, Boston comes. I mean, it's a hub of so. And with all due respect, to New England, for most people who don't live here, all those little tiny states up in the top right-hand corner, they all kind of, they all blend together. Everybody, when you grow up in Wisconsin, you learn where Texas is, and it's easy to learn where California is, and Alaska, and you remember Hawaii because it's an island, and then you have, Florida because it's got the squiggly bit, and you get up to the top right-hand corner, and you're like, oh my God, Dad, how do I learn all those places? And Dad probably says, don't worry about it, just New England. But not to be said, but the point is, that there are people coming in droves into Boston, right, looking for education,
of course.
and in Greater Boston, up into even UMass Lowell, etc. And so, UNH, Manchester, and Keene State, etc., rather than dropping employees and reducing professors like they did this year, it should be an easy sort of, come up here. You're within 50. Your kid's going to have the Greater Boston experience. I mean, it should be for a legislature. I know you're not running for local legislature, but New Hampshire needs to sort of have a more.
Well, the whole thing about sort of, bashing Massachusetts, well, the fact of the matter is, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
It's going to be there. Yeah. And there are wonderful resources, frankly, that the entire New England area actually provides. And, I grew up in New Hampshire. I was born here, whatever. I love this state. I love the beauty of this state. I love everything that this state has to offer.
Right.
And if we're going to see that continue, if we're going to see this state really thrive, we can't continue to just be the elder generation of New England, the one that is getting older and older and older.
Right.
It's imperative that we attract young people to this state. And there are jobs available, and they're largely high-skilled jobs. And we need to bring students to it. We need to expose people to the fact of what a wonderful place this is. It's a great place to raise a family. I have 4 kids. They're all grown and gone now. But and I was happy to raise them in my state, to raise them in New Hampshire.
And let me just say, since you're from the Seacoast area, the Seacoast area has in the last 20 years, as you well know, and maybe perhaps longer, but certainly in the last 20, in the sort of digital age, has done a wonderful job of growing native and companies, technology companies along the Seacoast corridor. And whatever that secret sauce is, it would be wonderful to see that spread more broadly.
There's no reason that it can't be, too. And there's many other areas of the state where that really could flourish.
Right.
But again, I think it goes back to, we're talking education. Well, the one thing that attracts people to a state, particularly families, and ultimately that's what we're talking about, is attracting young people who want to come back and raise a family here. And the key to that, one of the biggest attractors to people in terms of an area when they get of age where they're thinking about having a family, is the strength of the education system of the community that they're moving to.
Right.
And that's where this goes back to. New Hampshire absolutely has to do a better job of supporting public education. So people from other states will look at New Hampshire, look at communities within New Hampshire, and say, this is where I want to raise my family.
So then that brings us, let's go to sort of congressional power, national policy, right, federal policy. We have, and it'd be easy to spend, we could spend an hour now bashing Betsy DeVos, and it would be very easy to do, sort of like shooting fish in a barrel.
That's true.
And I don't want to waste time on Ms. DeVos doing that, because I think most people, anybody who's paying attention knows that. But there is an argument used about special education in particular, about how, that under the Education Act that it was originally envisioned that the federal government would pay 40% or so of special education costs. They've never gone above about 17% of it, and so and this is right in the this is a congressional issue. This is a budget issue, right? So what is your thinking on that topick? Federal funding for education.
Yes, well, and it's not just federal, because this was an issue when I was on the school board every single year, and Somersworth being one of the poorer communities. We struggled every year because of the cost of special education, because one or two cases, really, depending upon the severity of it, can really just devastate your budget, if you're trying to run a school district. And my entire lifetime, there's never been a case when the federal government nor the state government ever stepped up to the bar and paid the share that they had promised these school districts from the very beginning. And so of anything we do, that's one of the things that ought to be mandatory. We absolutely have to honor our obligations to special education, and then you'll have an availability of funds to local communities in their own public education systems, so that they can continue to do the other things that it's supposed to be doing, instead of dealing with the burden of special education without the additional funding that's been promised from both the federal and state levels for years.
As we have about 9 minutes left, let me try a couple of other things that are sort of outside my comfort zone, because they're not things I do every day, but a couple of things. Since your career in your career in the military, etc., we find ourselves today. There are so many topics we could talk about here that are going on.
Sure.
But to go back to the sort of now things that have become generational, sort of the presence in Iraq, the presence in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan today, as I understand it, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the U.S. government as a result, has abandoned most of the territory in Afghanistan. So we no longer have troops traveling overland in Afghanistan. Everybody gets airlifted everywhere. So one of the reasons why we have less casualties, and we're all grateful for that, is that we no longer send people out on patrol. We don't have people moving on the streets between Kandahar and Kabul. But the awful truth is, again, an underreported, I'm all for spending the last week and a half on that tragic story in Thailand, and we learned today that the last of the 13 kids is out. What a wonderful thing. And it's rightfully highlighted.
Yes.
But these realities, the distance between the experience of the military man and woman today and what they're doing, people like to, during certain holidays, Veterans Day, etc., to talk about the military. But there are people actually out there, and they're not political. They're doing a job, I think they're being badly served, etc. But I'd like you to give us your thoughts on sort of the U.S. military's involvement on these long campaigns.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I think it was just this past week we actually had a loss of life.
We did.
In was it in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan.
Afghanistan or
it was,
Iraq?
I think it was Afghanistan.
Okay, and that was from within. That
Yes.
was security forces that, ironically, we had trained actually,
Yes.
and we thought were our allies. So there are American soldiers and Allied soldiers that to this day are still giving their lives for those efforts. Of course, my view is we never should have gone into Iraq in the first place.
Right.
We never seem to have learned the lesson that Vietnam
Right.
should have taught us.
What happened to the Powell Doctrine? I mentioned it. How we forgot that so quickly. I
Yeah,
don't know.
well, of course, apparently we do own it now, don't we? Because
Right,
we did
right.
break it, both
We did.
Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
I mean, I think the time has come that, we're not going to salvage whatever the mission was, whatever the effort was. Frankly, I'm not sure anyone could tell us, why we were there to begin with. I know
Right.
I know Afghanistan was, to some sense, a reaction to
9/11,
9/11.
right.
Although, interestingly enough, the vast majority were from Saudi
Saudi
Arabia,
Arabia,
but
yeah.
there we are in Afghanistan. But and of course, we didn't lose we didn't learn the lesson from when the Soviets invaded
Right.
Afghanistan, right? So why we thought we could do a better job, I don't know. But in any event, frankly, we should be out of both of those theaters, in my view. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as the policemen of the world in that
Absolutely.
sense, and the adventurism, the idea that the United States it goes into a country preemptively. Up until the Iraq War, I can't think of an occasion where we had done that before.
Right.
Vietnam is a whole different situation.
Right. I think the only grey one to be historically sort of accurate, I think the only, sort of going back through lots of
Yes.
time, the Grenada situation was a little grey as to whether we were invited in.
Well,
or
that
went
was,
in,
but
but-
Grenada was more wag the dog
Yes,
thing.
yeah,
Something was
yeah,
going
yeah.
on. They were trying to distract us.
But again,
from,
it was a very in-out exercise,
exactly,
and it reminds
yeah.
you of the Schwarzkopf, Iraq One effort.
Yes.
You invade Kuwait, we go in, we spank you, we get out.
Right.
And
Right.
and so
Well, we never had a clear mission. We never had a plan of how to get out of either of Afghanistan
Right.
or Iraq.
Well, we had some very inept people, and I know that's easy to sort of throw around words like that, but the people that we sent into Iraq, for instance, the Wolfowitz people and those, but the guy Henry Kissinger's secretary who went in to lead the new Iraqi government, etc. He may be a lovely man, he may be a patriot, but he made a mess of that job, and he was
Absolutely.
he was
Yeah.
about as unqualified as the Arabian horse trainer was to deal with Hurricane whatever. So we're down to about 3 or 4 minutes. There's one other thing that, given your curriculum vitae, your resume, criminal justice. Where you there's on the opiate crisis, a major topic for the country and for the state of New Hampshire. We have about a couple of minutes or so, but
Sure.
if you'd like to touch off that, I think.
Well, I think one of the things that we need to recognize first and foremost is that the whole issue of addiction and the opioid crisis, we need to recognize that addiction's a medical problem. It's not a criminal justice problem.
Right.
And it's not going to be solved by the criminal justice system. It was Richard Nixon, if you remember, that began the so-called war on drugs.
Yes.
And of course, it's a total failure. I mean, the idea that, locking up suppliers and that somehow is going to change anything, until we address demand, until we do the research to be able to help people who have this. And of course, there are many, many things that contribute to it. You have the pharmaceutical industry itself, which has made things much worse with with the whole OxyContin thing, where for years they were telling people it's not addictive, whatever.
Right.
They pushed it on doctors, they're advertising it, and so forth. And many people started off sort of as a legitimate medical condition that they were trying to treat, and then eventually they get hooked, and the prices get so outrageous. And then people turn to things like heroin because it turned out to be cheaper. And there are many ways in which we got here. But to get us out of this, to begin to address it, we need to understand and we need to stop demonizing people who are in some ways self-medicating for whatever reason. And we need to view this as a medical issue, not a criminal justice issue. I think we ought to, just as an example, on the federal level, I think we should remove marijuana from the Schedule I drug listing. I think states should be free to decide whether or not they want to legalize marijuana. I think in some ways marijuana has been shown to assist people in terms of pain issues, in terms of its medical use and so forth. So there's many things that we can be doing, and clearly we need to be providing greater funds for rehabilitation services.
So with that, we're down to the last minute or so. If you want to take a moment and address the folks here on this camera in front, and just whatever your 1 minute spiel to the people of Manchester might be.
Well, I guess my spiel would be that, I've been serving the state of New Hampshire for most of my life. I would like to continue to do that in the service of those in Congressional District 1, which is Carol Shea Porter's district. Carol showed us a great deal about progressive values and supporting the people of this district. I would like to carry on her tradition. I'm not taking any corporate funds. I'm not taking any PAC money. I am building a grassroots campaign to serve the people of this district. I've spent my whole life in this district, and I hope to continue to serve the people of New Hampshire.
Wonderful. Well, Lincoln, it was a pleasure meeting you. I hope we meet
pleasure.
again. I wish you well.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to see so many excellent candidates running for office in the first congressional district, and I'm glad to have met you, and I hope to meet you again. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
You appreciate it. Thank you, folks. Yes, good night or good evening from Education Matters. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next Tuesday night, and you can see us during the week again. All the best from Jim O'Connell. Goodbye now.